The courtroom was filled with tension, as Judge Grayson, known for his harsh demeanor, prepared to make an example out of Caroline Leavitt. She had arrived late, and he wasted no time slamming his gavel, imposing a $500 fine for contempt. But Caroline wasn't just any defendant. She was a seasoned White House press secretary. What happened next would shock everyone and turn the tables on the very system that sought to silence her. Stay tuned. This is only the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and justice. As Caroline stood at the podium, her hands rested gently on the binder she clutched, neatly organized as always. Her eyes were calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. She had been to many courtrooms in her career, but this one felt different. The energy in the room was thick, and Judge Grayson's voice echoed in her mind. "You're not in the White House anymore, little girl." His words were meant to sting, to humiliate. And for a moment they did. But she quickly pushed the feeling aside. She had faced worse. She had faced much worse. This was just another battle. But this time she wouldn't stay silent. Grayson's gavel had slammed down with authority, and his words hung in the air like a cloud of judgment. $500 fine for contempt, he'd declared. It was as if he thought his power could crush her. The entire room waited, hoping she would flinch, hoping she would show weakness. But Caroline didn't flinch. She was standing tall, her posture as straight as it had ever been. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. The murmurs behind her, the hushed whispers in the gallery, they were all aware of the irony. She had walked into this courtroom expecting fairness, expecting professionalism, but instead she was met with bias and condescension. She could hear the judge's voice in her mind once again. "In my courtroom, we respect punctuality." Respect. The word lingered in her thoughts, almost mocking her. This wasn't about punctuality. It wasn't about being late. It was about power, about control, about showing who was in charge. And for a moment, Caroline felt a flicker of anger. But she kept it hidden beneath the surface of her calm exterior. No, she wouldn't let anger control her. She would use it. She had been in this position before, where people tried to silence her, tried to tell her that her voice didn't matter. It had happened in the White House too. But she had learned over time that silence didn't make you stronger. It made you complicit, and she wasn't going to be complicit today. "Your Honor," Caroline said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension in the room. Every eye shifted toward her. "Before we proceed, I must respectfully address something for the record." The judge's eyebrows furrowed. He hadn't expected her to speak up again. He had assumed he had won. "Miss Leavitt, your case is concluded," he snapped, clearly trying to dismiss her. "You may take your seat." But Caroline wasn't done. "Not yet." "I understand, Your Honor," she replied, her tone calm but unyielding. "But fairness in a courtroom shouldn't end when the gavel drops. What happened this morning warrants clarification." The words hung in the air, pregnant with promise. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. It was a small, simple gesture, but it carried weight. She opened it slowly, the pages rustling as she flipped through the notes she had written herself. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for what came next. "This notebook," Caroline began, "contains legal references, courtroom protocols, and notes I compiled during my years working closely with the legal team in President Trump's administration." Her words were deliberate, measured, and her confidence grew as she spoke. "While I am not a licensed attorney, I am well versed in judicial procedures and equal treatment standards." The courtroom was dead silent. The clerk, the bailiff, and even the judge couldn't hide their surprise. Grayson's face twitched. This wasn't what he expected. He hadn't anticipated a challenge, certainly not one like this. Caroline didn't back down. She opened to the first page of the notebook and began to read aloud, her voice unwavering. "At 9:02 a.m., I observed a man in his 60s arrive late by 4 minutes. He was not acknowledged by the bench." She paused, letting the words sink in. "At 9:04 a.m., I watched as a woman in a navy suit entered the courtroom, also late. She was not reprimanded. At 9:07 a.m. I entered, and I was fined $500 and publicly reprimanded. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Some defendants, some of whom had been in the courtroom for hours, exchanged glances. They were starting to understand what Caroline was doing. They were starting to see the disparity. Judge Grayson, I count 7 individuals who were late this morning, she continued. Only 2 received scolding. Both were under 30. One was me. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words was undeniable. Judge Grayson, clearly uncomfortable now, shifted in his seat. His grip on the gavel tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. This isn't about my title or my background, Caroline said, her gaze meeting his, with unwavering determination. It's about consistency. It's about fairness. It's about the message this courtroom sends to every young person who walks through those doors. Grayson leaned forward, his face tight. Miss Leavitt, Caroline didn't let him finish. Your Honor, I'm not here to be dismissed. I'm here to hold this system to the same standard you held me to this morning. The room was electrified with tension. Caroline had turned the tables, and now Judge Grayson was forced to listen. His authority was slipping away piece by piece. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Caroline stood tall, calm, and steady. I'm here for the truth, she thought, and I'm not leaving until it's heard. The moment of reckoning had arrived. As Caroline stood firm, her words slowly filling the air with undeniable clarity, a subtle shift happened just behind the scenes. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It had become a stage where Caroline's quiet determination resonated with everyone in it, especially with the one person who had been silently observing the scene unfold from the back. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, sat behind her desk, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She had seen countless cases, heard hundreds of reprimands, and witnessed the courtroom's daily power plays. But today, there was something different in the air. Caroline Leavitt wasn't just challenging the fine. She was challenging the very structure of authority that Margaret had silently accepted for years. Margaret had worked under Judge Grayson for more than a decade, and she knew him well, too well. She had seen his arrogance, his sharp tongue, and his relentless pursuit of making an example out of anyone who dared to question him. But this was different. Caroline's calm, controlled demeanor and the weight of her words made Margaret's heart race. Margaret's mind raced as she thought back to the countless small injustices she had quietly witnessed over the years. She had watched as Grayson dismissed men with wealth and status, offering them grace and second chances, while young women, especially women of color, were quickly punished, often for minor infractions. But what Caroline had done today wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just about one fine. It was a declaration. Caroline Leavitt wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been unjustly treated in this very courtroom. And in that moment, Margaret realized the weight of her silence over the years. She wasn't just complicit in the system. She had been a part of it, allowing it to persist unchecked and unchallenged. As Caroline finished speaking, Margaret's gaze never wavered. She slowly closed her laptop and took a deep breath. The sound of her heartbeat was louder in her ears than the voices of the courtroom, and the weight of her internal conflict was almost suffocating. Should she stand up? Should she say something? Should she break her years of silence? Margaret had always been the type to keep her head down, to follow the rules, even if the rules were flawed. She had accepted the fact that the courtroom was a place of power, and those in power had the final say. But Caroline Leavitt had just shown her something different. A whisper ran through the room, a faint sound, barely audible, but enough to catch Margaret's attention. One of the young defendants, a woman who had been scolded and fined earlier in the day, turned to another and muttered, "She's right, you know. It's always us. We get punished for being a few minutes late, but they get a pass." The woman's voice trembled, but there was a certain fierceness in it now. Margaret's eyes widened. This wasn't just Caroline challenging the system. This was the beginning of something bigger. The room had shifted. What Caroline had done was spark a fire of awareness, a fire of courage, and Margaret knew she was no longer just a passive observer. She was part of this now, whether she liked it or not. The tension in the room grew thicker as Caroline made her final statement. "I'm not here to be dismissed," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm here to ensure that fairness is not just a word we use when it suits us, but a principle that guides us every day." The room fell silent. Even the judge, who had moments ago tried to assert his dominance, couldn't find the words to respond. Caroline had taken control, not through loud demands, but through measured action. She wasn't asking for justice. She was demanding it, quietly, firmly, with a dignity that left no room for denial. Margaret felt her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced at the other court staff. The bailiff, Robert Hayes, who had always seemed indifferent to the ebb and flow of power in the courtroom, was now leaning slightly forward, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gaze was fixed on Caroline, a subtle nod of approval passing. Between them, Margaret couldn't help but wonder, had Robert always been aware of the injustice too? Was he, like her, just too afraid to speak up? In the back of her mind, Margaret knew this moment would change everything. She had seen the cracks in the system for years, but now they were wide open, exposed for everyone to see. She had always kept her head down, avoiding confrontation, telling herself that it wasn't her place to question the way things were done. But Caroline had just made it clear that silence was no longer an option. The room was no longer just a space for legal proceedings. It had transformed into a battleground, a place where power was shifting, where voices that had once been silenced were now demanding to be heard. Caroline Leavitt wasn't just a woman fighting for fairness. She was a woman who had turned an injustice into a movement. And as Margaret watched her stand at that podium, unshaken, unwavering, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Margaret looked down at the notebook she had kept hidden. For all these years, notes on the judges, the fines, the comments, she had never shared them with anyone, had never even acknowledged them to herself. But now, as Caroline's voice rang out through the courtroom, Margaret realized the truth. The system was broken, and it was time to fix it. With a deep breath, Margaret opened the drawer of her desk and pulled out the small leather-bound notebook. She knew what she had to do next. The time for silence was over. It was time to act. Margaret sat back in her chair, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. The courtroom had shifted, and it wasn't just because of Caroline's powerful stand. It was because the truth was finally being spoken out loud, and the silence that had enveloped this place for so long was beginning to fracture. Margaret could feel the tension in the air, thickening with every word that Caroline spoke, and she knew deep down that her own silence had played a part in the injustice. Margaret had always believed that if she did her job well enough, quietly, without fuss, she could avoid the complications that came with standing up against the system. But now, as Caroline Leavitt stood at the podium, she realized that her silence wasn't just a passive choice, it had been complicity. In the back of her mind, a familiar thought crept in. What if I speak up? What happens then? She had always feared the consequences of breaking the status quo, of challenging someone as powerful as Judge Grayson. After all, he had been the unchallenged authority for years. But Caroline wasn't just challenging the judge. She was calling out the entire system, the biases, the double standards, and the injustices that had been woven into the very fabric of the court. And the more Margaret listened, the more she realized that Caroline wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all of them. The room had grown eerily quiet save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional cough. Caroline, calm and collected, stood her ground as she proposed her three-point plan, each word calculated, every phrase sharp with precision. As she spoke, the gallery listened. The power dynamics in the room had shifted completely. The judge, who had once ruled with certainty, was now visibly uncomfortable. His posture had faltered, his hands trembled as they gripped the armrest. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control. Margaret watched the scene unfold, her heart beating faster. She had never seen Judge Grayson so shaken. He was used to having the final say. His courtroom was his kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist. But now, with Caroline's quiet power challenging his authority, everything was beginning to unravel. Margaret's mind raced. What happens if I don't act? If I let this moment pass without doing something, anything, will it be another missed opportunity? As the courtroom held its breath, Margaret's fingers lightly tapped the edge of her desk. She had never felt this conflicted. She had been in this job long enough to know the risks of challenging authority, but what Caroline was doing felt like something bigger than just a personal fight. It was about accountability. It was about acknowledging the cracks in the system that so many had been too afraid to expose. Margaret glanced at the other court staff. The bailiff, Robert Hayes, stood in his usual spot, arms crossed. His face was unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a slight leaning forward as if he too was waiting for something. Does he know what needs to be done? Margaret wondered. She had worked alongside Robert for years, but she had never seen him so engaged. It was as if Caroline's words had ignited something in him too. Caroline, with her unwavering resolve, finished her proposal. 3 actions, she had said. The silence in the room was deafening as the words hung. In the air, even Judge Grayson, the man who had once commanded the courtroom with a flick of his wrist, was now hesitating. Caroline had shifted the narrative. She had done something few dared to do, stand tall in the face of injustice without raising her voice, without demanding anything other than what was right. Margaret could feel her heart racing. It was no longer about Caroline's fine. It was about the integrity of the system itself. If I don't speak now, will I ever have the courage to speak up again? The thought gnawed at her. The power was in her hands now. She could feel it. She could either sit back and let things unfold, or she could take the first step in breaking the silence that had been festering in this courtroom for far too long. Judge Grayson shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Caroline and the court staff. He was trying to regain control, but it was slipping from his grasp. He knows it's over, Margaret thought. He knows that nothing will be the same after today. And then, with a sudden movement, Margaret stood. Her legs felt weak, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She walked toward the front of the courtroom, her mind set on one thing: speaking the truth. The room grew still as her shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Your Honor. Margaret's voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, clear, unwavering. I've worked in this courtroom for years, and I've seen the patterns. I've seen the double standards, the subtle biases that go unnoticed. Today, what Caroline has done isn't just about fairness in a courtroom. It's about holding each of us accountable, myself included. Margaret paused, allowing her words to sink in. The courtroom remained motionless. The bailiff, Robert, was staring at her now. His eyes held something, respect perhaps, or maybe a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. I have the records, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. I've kept track of the fines, the reprimands, the cases, and I've seen the numbers. I've seen the inconsistencies. It's time we stop pretending that the system is just. She turned toward Caroline, who stood with quiet dignity. What Caroline has done is show us the truth, and it's time we all faced it. The weight of her words hung in the air. Margaret had crossed a line, one she had been afraid to cross for so long. The courtroom that had once been a place of unquestioned authority was now a place of reckoning. The tension in the room was palpable as Margaret turned back to Judge Grayson. She didn't wait for his approval. She didn't need it anymore. I will be filing a formal report with the Judicial Review Board, she said, her voice clear and resolute. We will be reviewing the cases, the fines, and the patterns of bias. This will not go unnoticed, not anymore. Judge Grayson opened his mouth, but no words came out. The power had shifted. Margaret had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had made it clear that silence was no longer an option. The courtroom, once a place of rigid authority, had become a space for accountability. As Margaret returned to her seat, her heart raced, but there was no fear. For the first time, she felt the weight of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a catalyst for change. The room might have fallen silent, but the ripples of what had just happened would reverberate long after the doors closed. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the past few hours settled into Caroline's bones. She hadn't walked in with the intention of starting a movement, but now she felt that the smallest ripple had become a wave. She had faced the arrogance of an unjust system head-on, refusing to back down when confronted with disrespect. Her proposal, her unflinching stance against the bias that had been subtly woven into every corner of that courtroom, had altered the course of her own life and the lives of many others. Caroline glanced at the door, now closed behind her, the place where Judge Grayson had once held unwavering authority. The judge had walked out a defeated man, his pride cracked, and his legacy tarnished forever. And yet he wasn't the real casualty here. No, it was the system itself, the one that had allowed biases to fester, that had allowed the scales of justice to tip for years without consequence. Now the tables had turned. The courtroom that had once stood as a symbol of oppression would now stand as a monument to change. Weeks passed, and the reverberations of Caroline's actions began to show their true magnitude. The formal investigation into the court's practices began, and Margaret Evans, the longtime clerk, had become an ally, one of the first to speak out against the patterns she had silently observed for years. Her notebook, filled with evidence of bias and inequality, had been key to bringing everything to light. It wasn't just about Caroline anymore. It was about every person who had been unfairly reprimanded, who had been discriminated against for reasons beyond their control. It was about the community that had long been ignored, overlooked, or silenced. Judge Grayson, who had once held his power so comfortably, was now being scrutinized in ways he never imagined. The scandals surrounding his actions spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon the national conversation was ignited. The hashtag #JeerLegalGenius began trending, and Caroline became the face of judicial reform. But it wasn't about her. It was about every single person who had been silenced by the very institution that was meant to protect them. Her actions had laid bare the truth, and now the truth was impossible to ignore. The judicial review began, and with it, sweeping changes. New training programs were implemented for judges and court personnel to help them recognize and confront bias. The court, once a symbol of inequity, was slowly transforming into a place of accountability and fairness. What had been dismissed as a minor incident, Caroline's fine, had sparked a nationwide movement for justice and equality within the legal system. It was during a seminar she was invited to speak at that Caroline truly felt the weight of her actions. The room was filled with eager law students, young professionals, and reform advocates, all of whom had been following her journey. They had seen the video, heard the news, and now they were hearing her speak. Caroline had become a symbol, not of defiance for the sake of it, but of standing firm in the face of injustice and using her position not for power, but for change. "I was fined for being late," she began, her voice steady, but the weight of the past was heavy in the words. But what happened next? That fine wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. We often think of justice as something that happens in the courtroom, but what happens when the very people who are supposed to uphold it are the ones perpetuating the bias? The students listened intently as Caroline shared her story, not just of the courtroom incident, but of the long road ahead, the changes still to be made, and the work that still needed to be done. She didn't speak from a place of anger. She spoke from a place of determination, and the room hung on her every word. "Fairness isn't about who we are or where we come from," Caroline continued. "It's about what's right. The system is meant to serve us all equally. If we don't hold it accountable, if we don't stand up when we see inequality, then we're complicit. And that's not a world I want to live in." Her words resonated deeply with the crowd. Some of them had experienced similar injustices. Others had been unaware of the bias that could slip so easily into the legal system. But now, they understood. They understood that change wasn't about waiting for someone else to fix things. It was about speaking up, even when it seemed uncomfortable. It was about creating a new standard, one where fairness and equality weren't just ideals, but lived realities. Caroline's journey had begun with a small act of defiance. She had stood up to a man who thought he could control her, humiliate her, and send a message that he was the one in charge. But by the end of it all, the message had shifted. She wasn't just challenging a judge. She was challenging an entire system, and she wasn't doing it alone. She had brought everyone with her. As Caroline stepped down from the podium, the applause was thunderous, not because she was a hero, but because she had shown them all what true courage looked like. The room erupted into a standing ovation, but Caroline stood quietly, her heart full, knowing that the work had only just begun. There was still so much to do, but this was a beginning. Back in her office, as she gazed at the framed receipt for the fine that had started it all, Caroline couldn't help but smile. It wasn't about the fine. It was about the shift that had occurred, the ripple that had spread far beyond her. The world was changing, and she had played a part in that change. She had started a movement, not with anger, but with quiet strength and determination. She had shown that sometimes the smallest act of standing up can cause the largest waves of transformation. And for Caroline, that was enough. In the end, the system had been forced to confront its flaws, and the power that had once been held by a single individual was now shared by many. Caroline had not just changed a courtroom, she had changed the narrative. The fight for justice, for fairness, for equality was far from over, but now everyone knew it was possible, and that, in itself, was a victory.